It's great to see so many people joining in. Thank you all for making time during your busy schedule to join us today. Just wait a minute or two to see if everybody is connected that's planning to. So hopefully you all got the message so that you know that the meeting is being recorded. Basically just making it available for people who couldn't attend today. So just want to take a moment and introduce myself. I'm Alice Stenstrom. I'm the president of ACCHO. So thank you very much for attending. And I want to start like we do meetings at almost all the culture organizations that you go to with a land acknowledgement. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge that as we gather today, many of us are on historic and contemporary lands of the Duwamish, Squamish, and other Coast Salish people. We acknowledge the forced displacement of the Native communities from this land. We thank them for their respectful stewardship of the land and honor their endurance through generations to the present. So I know that you really didn't come to hear me talk. So I am going to turn this over to Aaron Alcorn, who is another member of the board of ACCHO, who with his committee put together this great program. So Aaron, please.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Aaron Alcorn. I'm the vice president of ACCHO. And I kind of lead the cabal of the programming cabal that comes up with fun things for programming. And I'm really happy that we're going to be kicking off with Sarah. This will be part of a series of programs that we're going to be offering this year, which will be exploring various aspects of diversity and inclusion. So more information will be forthcoming about that. But so Sarah, I'm sure everyone knows Sarah, so she doesn't need introduction, but I get a chance to do it anyway. So Sarah is the landmarks coordinator for King County. So what does that mean? As part of that, she basically is in charge of works with the historic preservation program, so works with designated historic properties and community organizations that are dedicated to preservation and heritage throughout the county. So it's a pretty big job.
Yeah, I'd say so.
But I'm not gonna steal any thunder about sort of what Sarah is going to talk about. I'm just going to sort of turn it over because any attempt to do, I will be inartful. So.
Well, thank you very much, Aaron. And thank you, ACCHO, for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to share my screen to kick us off. Let's see. Come on, there we go. Can everyone see that? Yes, okay. Well, as Aaron said, I'm the landmarks coordinator for King County. We are a small 4-person crew that works with historic, both above ground and below ground resources throughout King County, and 23 cities with whom we have interlocal agreements. Just as a general introduction, we have been working lately on what we're calling the Landmark Nomination Inclusion Project. And just to give a little background. So as I was really going through this presentation, this is the first of probably a series of workshops on this project, just to kind of explain it to the broader community and to expand our understanding and everyone's understanding of what work we're doing and what other people are doing. But as I was really kind of framing how I was going to explain what this is, I came across this quote that until we recover and replace the stories of the people who were deleted, we will, without even knowing it, continue to carry forward the deliberate bigotry of the past. And I thought that really summed up what we're trying to do really nicely. And actually the article was written in Time magazine by Rachel Lance, who as a doctoral student at Duke University, found evidence that the oldest known copy of the Gospel of John was physically altered to reduce the role of Mary Magdalene. So that exemplifies the fact that this is not a new problem that we're dealing with, as we really look to examine our narratives that we have established critically. And I was also thinking about the general role of historians, what we do as a practice, all of us, whether we're dealing with built environment resources or documentary evidence or artifacts. One of our essential roles is to frame history. We create coherent narratives to communicate meaning. And this is especially important across time when we can't experience things directly and form our own ideas. We communicate to each other through storytelling. Humans are natural storytellers. But one of the ways that that can be very easily distorted is when dominant actors in a given culture frame all the narratives. And that's one of the things that not only us in historic preservation, but people throughout history, any sort of historical field, whether you're dealing with cultural resources or historical resources, or even if you're in just a general member of society and you have no interest in history, this is still something that is shaping your life. We're grappling with basically a white and specifically white male framework, narrative framework of American history. And we're seeking ways to address and ameliorate and correct that. To do this, to accomplish this, the first thing we need to do is to really develop a critical understanding of how to examine our own past. We need to understand the waters that we're swimming in. We need to recognize the pervasive givens and assumptions of any cultural understanding. And the second half of that is to actively seek a more accurate and dynamic understanding of our past. We need to seek out the stories that have been silenced. We need to elevate them and understand their place within the broader narrative. If we silence most of the voices in the world, which is what we talk about when we're only looking at one specifically white male perspective, we will have no understanding of who we are and how we got here. So it's vitally important that we understand that our history is much broader and much more dynamic than a lot of our own histories have led us to believe. And we are all trying to work on that effort in one way or another. And that's becoming more and more prominent, as Erin said, within all of our conversations lately. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our methodology. So how we're doing this on a practical level, both King County, the Historic Preservation Program, and other people, is we're looking forward and looking back. So one of the key components that we've been working with is a four-culture work group called Beyond Integrity. They have been really focused on examining the failures of looking only at architectural integrity to determine significance. And they're interested in developing kind of the practical framework and institutional criticism to elevate the idea of cultural significance on par with architectural integrity. So instead of just relying on something reading historic and being able to convey it through how it appears, we need to recognize cultural significance as on par with that. And how do we express that if it can't be easily read in the landscape? How do we get those cultural significance markers across? How do we explain it to other people what the meaning of this is? Again, conveying meaning. And so one of the things that Beyond Integrity has really been examining are traditional preservation practices as a whole and how to improve them, how to implement them, how to move them forward, how to make them more inclusive, how to broaden this conversation in the necessary ways that I've been talking about. And one of the things they did is they created this internship, an equity and preservation internship, a number of years ago. And we took some of the work that their first intern did, Stephanie Barrera-Aguila, and we built on it. She examined more resources in Seattle outside of our purview. We mostly deal with King County and cities within King County outside of Seattle. But we recognized the value of her work and we built on it in one particular way. We used the Justice White House. That's one of the projects I'm going to be outlining here. And we extended her ideas into examining our own landmarks. So King County has probably between 5,000 and 6,000 inventoried historic resources throughout the county, but we only have about 300 of those which are designated landmarks. And so we started there. We did an analysis of the landmarks that we have against the information that we have, and we identified about a dozen or so that really we're in desperate need of some sort of revision. Each of these landmarks excluded or omitted or overlooked some member, community member or community in general, generally underrepresented, from women to Black coal miners, for example, to Japanese communities. Someone was not mentioned as being significant to the resource that was. And so we identified what those resources were, what we knew was missing, and we started prioritizing work on those. And I'm going to talk about 3 that we've already started working on, 2 which are nearly done, one's about halfway done, and just kind of talk about how we approach that, what we discovered along the way, and what the outcome is. So I'm going to start with the Falls City Hop Shed, built in Falls City in 1888. This is actually the site that I'm showing here is the second site where the Falls City was. It was actually built about a mile southeast of here. Originally used in hop farming, which I'll get a little bit more detail into, but the site itself is important. Where it was moved to is also important. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the building itself, just so you can recognize the form, because it's pretty idiosyncratic. To my knowledge, this is the only hop kiln. It's technically a hop kiln that was used to dry hops. The only one left on the west side of the Cascades. I could be wrong about that, but in my studies that I haven't found any others. I know that there are a few that are designated east of the Cascades in the Yakima region, but this is the only one that we know of here. And what it was used for is, anyone who's familiar with hops is frequently used in beer. It changes the flavor and makes it more preservable. But hops are a cluster of flowers that are grown on vines that hang down. And what you would do when you cultivate them is you knock the vines down, pull the flowers off, and dry them for shipping. And so these kilns were located when the hops craze was happening in the 1880s and 1890s. These were ubiquitous around both Oregon and Washington countrysides. You'd see them everywhere. And they're pretty identifiable through form. You'd see them as tall, narrow structures, square or rectangular, with steep roofs and cupolas on top. And the hops would be dried on a raised platform inside with a heating unit underneath. They'd spread the hops out and dry them, and the cupola would let the moisture and the air circulate and the heat escape. And so you can pretty easily identify them when you see them in the landscape. If you see structures that look like that, they're probably hop kilns. As I said, that we don't have a lot left. This one happens to be located right across from downtown Falls City, across the Snoqualmie River from downtown Falls City. And it was, as I said, it was moved there in 1904 when it stopped being used as a hop kiln, actually. The landmark nomination itself was written in 1982, and it was about the significant section. So for those of you who don't know, landmark nominations generally come in two pieces of important information. You have the architectural description of the structure itself, and then you have the context, the significance, why it's important, what's the story behind it. That's where the meaning is conveyed. And in this case, there were about 3 paragraphs explaining the meaning of the hop shed, and almost none of it had anything to do with the hop shed itself. Just as a basis of comparison, we typically, nowadays, landmark nominations are typically anywhere from 10 to 20 pages in this particular section. So 3 paragraphs is pretty sparse. It talked a lot about the hops craze of the 1880s and 1890s, when almost everyone was cultivating hops around here, because the European crop had failed, and the expansion of the railroad made this a really lucrative crop for people to grow. And it's associated with the Snoqualmie Hop Ranch, which was the state's largest. It was about 3 miles north of where the hop shed is now. And so they associated the hop shed that is in Falls City now with this hop ranch, even though it wasn't associated with it. It wasn't used on that farm, but that was what they talked about, just to kind of, as a general example of a wider trend. So in working, what we did, there's 2 of these projects that I'm gonna talk about today that we secured some state grant funding to hire Jamie Merriman Cohen, who I'm actually presenting her work now. She was the primary author and researcher on this project, and she's done exemplary work on this, and I need to give her a lot of credit and props for that. And she's also working with me on the Newcastle one. So those 2, we're working with her. And I'm hoping in the future for future presentations that she'll be able to join me for them. But right now I'm going to present what she did. The things that we really worked on to develop this nomination was we refocused on the site itself. And I don't speak Lushootseed, so I'm not going to try to pronounce the village site that used to be here, but this is on the site of one of the most important, largest Snoqualmie villages in the area. It had as many as 18 longhouses. It was a big residential community. it was also, it has been described in a number of historical documents as a military training center for the Snoqualmie tribe. So this was a really key area for the tribes. And there's a rich history, not only of the tribal use of 10,000 years to now, but of how the interaction between early settlement and the tribal relations in that area. So we tried to capture some of that. We also use this because it is such a rare resource, because there are so few hop kilns left, and especially given where it is. We wanted to really expand on the descriptions of tribal history in the hops industry. And this was really fascinating to me. So hops harvesting is a very short season. It's about 3 weeks in September. And everybody would come to do that work, to harvest hops seasonally. I know in Oregon, when I was growing up, we used to hear about families who would go, and it was kind of a party atmosphere. Everyone would work, and it was their version of a working vacation. Here, you have people traveling from all over, but a huge part of that agricultural worker segment were the tribal members who traveled from anywhere from east of the Cascades from Alaska and BC. They would come to take part in this harvest. And the seasonal migration patterns were so important that they would affect Seattle. Like you can find pictures of encampments on the waterfront of Seattle of migrant hops workers coming in from around and gathering in Seattle first and then going out to the hops fields to work. There's a book that Jamie found called, was introduced to her, Coal Thrush, Native Seattle Introduced Histories from the Crossing Over Place, that talked about these migrant workers being part of Seattle's urban cadence, which I always like the sound of. It gives kind of a musical or a breathing aspect to it. It's like they were just part of the fabric of that part of Seattle's life. And it's also important if you're looking at the changes in the native landscape at this time in the 1880s and 1890s, how those cultures adapted to continue to survive within the landscape, how they reoriented their gatherings to change according to the land. Like all of this stuff is part of this whole story, and it's important to capture, especially in a representative building like the hops kiln. And last, kind of as a summary of the top two, we're recentering the hop shed as a representative of a larger cultural landscape. It is the center of a pretty important just life in this Puget Sound region in the 1880s and 1890s, and we needed to reflect that. So we're trying to really kind of center it as telling these stories as reflective of those, so it becomes part of that storytelling ability. So that is the hop shed. The next one is the Newcastle Cemetery. This one is also written in 1982. This is actually really hard, as you might be able to tell from the photograph. It's hard to capture this site. So it's about a 2-acre site near Lake Boren in Newcastle, and it's only a part of it is level. It slopes up in areas and slopes down in other areas, and it's really overgrown with trees and other infill. This cemetery was ignored for a long time. There was a big fire that came through it in 1921 and destroyed all the wooden markers. And then just years of neglect, a lot of the other markers were either broken or lost or moved, just vandalism and neglect. And it's only been probably in the last 20 years that the landscaping has been cut down to reveal more of the cemetery, but we still don't really know how many people are there. And some of the things that we really wanted to do with this one was talk a little bit about the coal mining history. We do have other coal resources here that address this. But coal mining history was one of the top 3 industries. You have lumber, coal, and to a lesser extent, agriculture that were really forming the last quarter century of the 19th century. That was the driving industries, and that's what brought people here. And mining especially was heavy immigrant draw. So people were coming in from around the world. And a lot of the Eastern, Southern, and Northern Europeans and Scandinavians are pretty well documented. But what isn't captured are a lot of the Black mining history that's here. And I know Ryan Donaldson is on this meeting, and we've worked closely with him. He's done some exceptional work tracing his family lineage in Roslyn, which was another coal mining town, very important one. And we've worked with the cemetery folks over in Roslyn as well, because they have an exceptional cemetery over there. I would strongly recommend anyone go see it if you have a chance. But to build out the Newcastle Cemetery nomination, we needed to understand who was there and why. And so that led us into the the influx of African-American coal miners that were brought from the Midwest as strike breakers, dealing with some of the labor unrest and the unionization during that time. So we got into their stories, and then the Chinese stories, which have actually become a little bit more elusive, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But in order to explain how the cemetery is how it is, you need to understand how people came to be there, and that's a key thing that was left out of that nomination. The original nomination mostly covered coal mining and railroad history, which is pretty standard. You'd hear about that in most of the nominations, but it really doesn't talk about the people, which is kind of surprising. Or it doesn't talk about them in any length. In this particular cemetery, there was a black section. They were typically segregated. So you have black and Chinese burials separately than the white. So the white burials of different ethnicities were all kind of gathered in the level area of the cemetery. And the two black gravestones that we know are there are in the southwest corner. They're beyond what the original fence line. So originally they were outside of the cemetery. That fence is no longer there. So you can't really tell that it's separate, but at the time it was intended to be. The tricky part of this is actually the Chinese burials. I don't know how much you all know about the history of Chinese funerary practices in the US, but from about 1860 to probably close to 1930, the tradition was, as you all do probably know, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and even well before then, it was very difficult for Chinese workers to bring their families in. And so when they died here, when these workers who were very connected to family back home died here, they would be exhumed after about 7 years. So they would have neighborhood associations that would be paid for, that were based in the regions from which they came. And they would pay to have these collectors go around, exhume the bodies and clean the bones, anything that was left, any soft tissue that was left. The bones would be cleaned and boxed, and they would be sent to this hospital in Hong Kong to be disseminated to the families. So they would end up with their extended families back home. That stopped in the early 1830s when Japan, as far as I know, as I can find out, that stopped when Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931. I haven't found any after that. And that's the general idea, is that they stopped then. But that is exactly what makes it tricky to locate where the burials might have been. If the people had been removed, we're working mostly on anecdotal evidence. We've had a number of reports of people in the 80s saying they saw Chinese characters on gravestones in the Newcastle Cemetery, but we haven't been able to find any evidence to back that up, and we can't find them. So either they were gone, or the landscape has taken them over, or something else happened. But we're still working on seeing what we can track down about the Chinese burials in the Newcastle Cemetery. It's been a little elusive, but it's kind of the detective work that I enjoy. The last of the projects that we are working on, that I'm working on, Jamie's been working on the top two. This is one that we've been working on in our office, just us. It's the Hotel Redmond, built in 1897, 1898. It's a prominent building in downtown Redmond still. It's a little bit south of the main downtown, but you can still find it there. And it looks pretty much like it does in this picture with the Hotel Redmond sign on the top. That was one of the ones that the For Culture intern identified as really needing an upgrade or revision to include Emma McRedmond White. So the house was actually nominated in 2010. So this is one of the later nominations that we're dealing with, but it was nominated as the Justice William White House. And he was a very, very prominent political figure in this region. He was a US attorney for the 3rd District of the Washington Territory. He served as a state Supreme Court justice. He was very vocal and involved in regional and national politics. He was a prominent Democrat, and he became a prominent Bull Moose Party, the Teddy Roosevelt Party, a progressive. And so the nomination really details most of his political life, kind of the broad strokes of his political achievements. But it doesn't really talk about Emma. It gives her about a half a paragraph, and she's defined almost entirely by her relationship to William White and her father, Luke McRedmond, who was one of the settlers of Redmond, the earlier land claimants in Redmond. But actually, she was pretty remarkable. There's a good chance we're finding new evidence that she was instrumental in building and running the hotel, even before they were married. And it was a socially and politically important place. It was one of the most prominent hotels in the region. She was Redmond's postmistress for 16 years, one of the very few women serving in that role. Washington State recognized the women's right to vote 10 years before it happened nationally. So in 1910, women were granted the right to vote. And she ran for office 2 years later as county clerk. She lost by about 10,000 votes, but she had a good showing for a woman candidate 2 years after they were allowed to vote. She was the first woman delegate from the territory and potentially from the nation to serve as delegate in a presidential election. And she was a very prominent political organizer promoting women in legislative and political roles in the region. And all of this we got from a handful of newspaper articles, because she wasn't nearly as well documented as he was. But there was a lot you could get from those articles, and her prominence and her activity throughout her whole life was very evident here. And she wasn't recognized as one of the important people in the Justice White House. And that needed to change. So we're actually looking at altering the name as it goes through the process of being amended. It's going to go back to the name Hotel Redmond, and both of them will be recognized as significant figures within that framework of the nomination. But it brought up something else that I wanted to talk about a little bit. It's a little bit more philosophical, but one of the things that William is really recognized for is his role in the 1886 riots, the anti-Chinese riots. So similar to what was happening in the coal mining regions, the labor unrest was happening everywhere because of stagnant wages, shifts in the power dynamics between labor and capital. Like, all these things were happening that were kind of sparking the organization of labor unions and concurrently a rise in anti-Chinese rhetoric and violence. And these were hitting their peaks from about 1884 to 1886. And in Seattle, there was a big riot where the Knights of Labor really instigated people going from door to door and pulling the 300 Chinese residents in downtown Seattle out to shuttle them onto waiting ships to get them out of town. William White was then the US District Attorney, and he, along with the sheriff and the mayor, Henry Esler, and others, went down to try to stop the mob. They called out the Home Guard, and they tried to keep the mob from deporting the Chinese residents. And then later, after the riot, he brought grand jury indictments against 15 men for harassing and conspiring to violate the civil rights of the Chinese residents. So whenever you hear, especially current articles about William White, they talk about him as a civil rights activist. But one of the things that I introduced, actually Stephanie, the intern with For Culture, first caught this. She's like, she, in her analysis and her kind of narrative, she talked about how he can't really be seen as a civil rights activist. Well, what he did was important and laudable. There was a little bit more to that story than that. And so when I was filling out his nomination, I started looking a little bit deeper into his political history, especially given that he's nominated for his political history. And he was a progressive. And if you read his speeches at the time, he's following progressivist views, which are really nationalist patrician. They're following Teddy Roosevelt, the whole civilizing the world kind of theology. It's very Rudyard Kipling, white man's burden kind of thing. And so you could argue that he understood that certain things about civil rights and that he had struggled with others. And so I wanted to present a more nuanced view of who he was politically, just to kind of have a better conversation about his importance and why. And to I'm bringing it up now to really talk about kind of, I guess it's a human desire to have the people that we elevate, the people that we recognize, have a certain shine to them. We want them to be admirable. So we try to select the things that are admirable based on our own, modern day sensibilities. And I think we lose something that way. I think if we try to literally whitewash, if we try to simplify, if we don't talk about the political nuances of some of these figures and their complexities and their human failings, we don't get those conversational tangents that really give you a better view of what actually was happening at the time. And so I'm introducing this to kind of directly work on or bring up the discussion of how to talk about complex people and how do we represent these in the historical narratives that we put forward. So in this nomination, I didn't seek to totally explain what progressivism was or what its results were, but I did leave a lot of, I guess you could say, Easter eggs. I put things in there that gave people really solid leads if they wanted to follow up on it. Because the role of a nomination is not to try to explain all the history. We're trying to center a resource and explain the larger significance around it. But I think you can very easily put things in that lead up people to additional research and to additional questions and additional discussion. And I think those things should be included as a matter of course in our nominations. The next steps. So a lot of what we're trying to do is change things on in a conceptual, philosophical way of thinking about history and the built environment and what importance is and how we make those determinations, but it's also practical implementation of these values. So we're looking at how do we really educate our commissions to be critical of the things that are put forward? How do we educate our staffs to understand how to research, how to make sure that the Black Heritage Society or that Wing Luke are as routine stops as is the Puget Sound Regional Archives? How do we strengthen all of our relationships to each other so we can use each other's work to build on and create a more dynamic narrative? All of these things are the things that we're working on now, I think. One of the things that I think we should do, what I would love to start seeing happen, and I think is starting to happen, is I'd like to see culturally specific surveys. Like instead of taking resources and working back, I'd like to take a community and work forward. Find the places that maybe are missing or that have changed that we wouldn't recognize otherwise. Like start using different approaches to discover the same resources in the community that we don't know are there. When I go back, like in a few years after we have accomplished more studies, after more work has been done, which is ongoing, and I go back through all of our landmark nominations, I want to be able to find more that reflect things I didn't know. Because the ones that I did analyze, I was able to use the information I had, but I know that there's some that I just didn't know what was there. And so we need more surveys. We need more surveys from other points of view. We need to be looking at different things. We need to be asking the right questions. And I think we're moving in that direction, but it's just important that we really center that in our work going forward. And I actually got through this a lot faster than I did when I was practicing. But thank you all for your time and attention today. Not only for being here, but I also recognize that all of you in one way or another are interested in or actively working in history in some sort of study. And I know that everything I do is improved and informed by everything you do. So we're all in this together. So I really want to thank you for your time and attention and offering me the resources that I use on a daily basis to move forward. So thank you for that. And I'm here to answer any questions you may have. Yes, Ryan, I guess I'm answering. I'll just go on the hands that go up.
Oh, okay. I was applauding you first, Sarah. So thank you for your presentation today. It was wonderful. And just wanted to thank you for your help in terms of some of the research that is going on in Kittitas County with the Rosalind mining site. I was just wondering if you could speak a bit more to you'd mentioned period newspapers, you had mentioned oral tradition as a way to kind of augment the documentation efforts. And I understand, and I can certainly sympathize with some of the challenges where, the site has changed significantly, thinking of a Newcastle. And I'm just wondering if you can maybe speak a bit more to, additional resources you've seen or kind of some helpful ways to be able to find out more about these sites.
Yeah, that's a really good question. For Newcastle, I feel like we're still on the surface level. We're going through we're working through the Historical Society there, and they have a pretty amazing wealth of resources, but we're working back. Like we'll find something like someone in 1980 said they saw these markers. So we need to find out who that is and then see if we can find any sort of relationship to that person, and then maybe look at different kinds of maps from areas that might reflect that. So for us, because we haven't gotten too far, it's mostly just any small, we analyze what we can find, and any piece of that offers a lead, we try to track it down. And that could be anything from government records of particular, burials or newspaper articles like Genealogy Bank and others, Family Search. Those are actually becoming really important tools because you can search through obituaries or newspaper articles. I used that heavily when I was doing the Redmond research. Those are, now as more collections become digitized, those newspapers become more accessible. It hasn't been as effective with Newcastle. We're just really still working on the ground to try to trace whatever leads we can. I know that's not a super satisfying answer, but it's also reaching out to other, like the connection between Roslyn and Newcastle has given leads and understanding in the stories and possibly new directions to go. So that's also key. It's just make connections with other people doing similar work that might be related.
Oh, I will just leap in here. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was fascinating. I just sort of disappeared for a while, just listening to your presentation. It was wonderful. But I do want to respond to Jeff had a question in the chat, and I'm sure others are thinking the same thing. How can we ensure that new nomination submissions, not just amended ones, are telling a complete history?
Yes, and that is kind of what we were talking about when I talked about moving forward. We need to, one of the first things I look at when I'm looking at a new nomination is I look at the region, I look at what we know, whatever studies we have, and I start asking what's not there. What isn't being, you know that other people are around, you know they are, we know they are by now. And so what isn't presented here? And you start kind of tracing those lines to see, based on what information I might have, or if I need to go out of what I have, I need to see, like if I'm looking at somewhere in Kirkland maybe, and I happen to know that there were certain communities that were there during certain times, but they're not presented in that nomination, that's what I would start analyzing for. So it's really, you just kind of have to step into the bath and develop those relationships with people that do know. So you can say, hey, I'm noticing there's a gap here. What can you tell me about this? And so you start kind of developing that critical eye that can lead you in the right direction. But it just takes, don't assume that what you're reading is everything. Go from there. Like, just recognize it probably is, we're selectively framing something and there's a reason for that, but it also does exclude really necessary parts of that conversation.
Anyone else?
Linda. You're still muted, Linda.
There, how's that?
That's better.
Much better, I'm sure. My question is, then you're working off that list that you showed in the first part of your presentation. And what is the criteria? Maybe you said, I somehow missed that, as to what you're choosing when.
It was really easy to start with the older nominations. We knew that they were lacking a lot. But for the remainder of them, we analyzed it based against what we had in our records that we'd built in our records from that time. Like Neely mentions actually on that list. Oh. But although a lot of that history was captured with the Hori Faruba. So we do know that because so much work was done on the bathhouse associated with Neely Mansion, we knew a lot of the Neely Mansion history. But the Neely Mansion nomination made it on there regardless because we had another source of information. So that's what informed a lot of my initial analysis. Like, what information have we gathered since this nomination has happened? And how can I look at this through that lens? And that's why I said at the end, the more information that we get, the better I'm gonna be able to be, and others are gonna be able to be, at analyzing what's missing from our existing nominations. And so that's why I was calling for, I think a constant call for more research on our historical fabric of what has happened in King County. A lot of reading, you could say. It's a lot of reading.
Thank you.
I can just jump in and add that if folks are interested in diving into those lists and the intern reports, both Stephanie's and then a lot of work on the kind of initial pass through landmark nominations was done by Xiaoling Liu. She was our very first intern as well. And those reports are on For Culture's website. There's a Beyond Integrity page, and I can link to that in the chat if you're interested.
That'd be great. Thank you, Dana.
And we also had a quick follow-up from, So Jeff had asked, he's without audio today, are there any King County cultural focus surveys in the works? And then Jennifer is just went ahead and gave a quick reply. So check the chat to follow that.
One of the things that we do have access to that I'm going to promote a little bit here are called CLG grants, and that's how we funded Jamie Merriman Cohn's involvement here. So CLG grants are certified local government grants that are available through DAP, through the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. And King County is a CLG. We are an umbrella certified local government for all the 23 cities that we work with and the unincorporated areas. And just to explain, a CLG is any sort of government entity that has added a preservation framework within its planning process. So if you have a commission, if you have a local register, if you've hit all these thresholds, you can become a certified local government. What that does is open up planning funding. So we can fund projects like working on these nominations. And that's frequently what the pot of money we go to hit these kind of culturally significant revisions or re-examinations of what we have, as we use this planning funding to do that. And we can offer that to any of the cities that we work with in King County too. So if you come up with a project that you think is important and it's within King County and it's within some part of connection that we have with you, then let us know. Because it doesn't have to be just the projects we come up with. We take input all the time from other people who see things that we haven't seen or have an idea to pursue. We really welcome that input. So please feel free to contact us.
A question, if it's okay, just to jump in.
Yeah.
I appreciate Jeff's comments about question about how we ensure that submissions are telling a complete history. And I apologize for not knowing exactly what your relationship is to the Landmarks nomination board. Mm-hmm. But I think sometimes we even, I don't know that we can ever have complete histories, right? There's always new information that is uncovered. But I'm also interested in the preservation process itself, which I think is kind of flawed. But I'm not really sure what pathways there are for improving that or who oversees it. So I'm thinking, for example, of the recent failure of the nomination of the Booth building, which was a really important, has a really important relationship to women's history, and it would have passed, except somebody just walked out and took a phone call, and then the vote happened at that time. So elements like that. And also I think the criteria itself is a little bit flawed when it comes to how it reflects what we value in history. So I'm interested in just learning a little bit more about your perspective on that and how as a community we can work on that and so that going forward, more complete histories are told and more often preserved.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. So just to explain what I do, I staff the King County Landmarks Commission. So I'm intimately involved in the development, promotion of landmark nominations. I write a number of them and I revise them. So I'm pretty enmeshed in this process, pretty intimate with it. But we don't work with Seattle. So Seattle has a different program than King County does. And the issues you raised are exactly what Beyond Integrity and others are talking about right now. We're looking at ways to practically implement structural changes in how preservation is accomplished. And some of that's going to move quickly. I think work groups like Beyond Integrity are great for not only going back and reanalyzing what we've done and being able to clearly identify how we have not been able to capture these histories, but also develop ideas moving forward that can be implemented. But implementing them is going to take a little more time because a lot of the criteria that we use is developed on the federal level. And a lot of preservation funding, and this is just kind of my general understanding, preservation funding is centered around the criteria that have been established. And because preservation has been kind of it's had a tenuous presence, it's hard to, it's just on my experience as being a preservationist over the last 10 years, it's not it's something we constantly have to advocate for, to argue that money should be going toward preservation. It's always like art, you know, it's one of the things that gets cut first. So that we have this solid criteria, solid Secretary of Standards criteria, that we've put a whole bunch of regulations and money around. So we have that as the center of it. To change that is going to take a lot of work and a long time. I think we can start using groups like Beyond Integrity to implement on a local level with the Landmarks Commission that I work with, for example. We have a policy and planning committee that's kind of the visionary of that Landmarks Commission, and we are starting to introduce the ideas of Beyond Integrity there, and so it will become part of what we do with the Landmarks Commission. So that's in that way, on a local kind of granular level, you can implement some of these changes a little quicker on the local, within Landmarks Commissions, if you have people who are interested in promoting these new ideas of cultural significance, of cultural landscapes, of how to really recognize and promote these questions above architectural, kind of a more rigid architectural integrity question. On a federal level, though, on a national level, it's going to probably take, because we're going to have to really, and I know that it's being talked about on all levels of preservation work, but I just see the framework around the federal standards, it's there, the conversation's happening, but it's just going to take a little longer. And I think the more people who get involved on a local level, the more people who are interested in talking about this. Beyond Integrity is a working group that's open to anyone. So if you do want to, if you're interested, you can take part. So, you know, become part of serve on a Landmarks Commission. Those are appointed positions. They're open to community members. Just find ways to insert yourself into the process, and you'll be able to have a greater effect on those changes, I think. So that would be my recommendation. I look forward to when we all can meet again, because usually when I present, I'm up and walking and I gesture big, and it's hard to sit here and kind of remain, but I'm very much looking forward to seeing you all in person some other time when we do this again.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. I think you've given us all a call to action. You really need to look at our communities and say, you know, what should have landmark status? And, you know, the earlier we get to that process, and not when, you know, potentially something's going to be put to a new purpose, whether it's destroyed or dramatically altered. You know, we may know of things and know their history, and we just really need to make sure that we're all being proactive. And that's one of the things that ATCHO is happy to do, is to support you in your advocacy efforts. You know, we write letters to city councils or county or whoever is appropriate in any way that we can do to help with these projects. So don't be shy about, you know, asking for help. And not just ATCHO, but your other, you know, the other member organizations in ATCHO. We all want to help each other. And if somebody, you know, presents a project, then, you know, another community in King County can certainly add their support as to, you know, why it's important, because often the significance of something goes beyond the immediate community. It's affected, you know, the county, the state, the whatever. And we all want to help each other succeed. So don't be shy.
I also want to mention that landmark nominations can be developed by anyone. They've kind of developed into a little bit more of a sophisticated tool. So I often recommend people get consultants help, or people who have experience. For Culture, for one, has a really great special projects grant program available for people who do want to develop nominations. But really, if you have something that you believe is significant, for whatever cultural associations that you're aware of, you can start talking about developing a nomination. So that's another way to approach the nomination process, to change it on a granular level. If you start promoting the sites and the, you know, the features and the landscapes that you believe should be nominated, that's just another way to kind of affect change on a real practical level.
Thanks again, Sarah. I'm going to say that if you have any questions, Sarah, you can give the best way to get a hold of you, but we actually have some other business to do at the meeting today. Not nearly as interesting or fun as Sarah's stuff. So,
well, thank you all again.